Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Makpool with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be taking a look at what is happening on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session and of course as part of the high-level debate which has started, and we have of course seen that this is an important part of the current scenario, considering of course the speech ahead of this session that was made by the UN Secretary General Mr. Antonio Guterres, who has highlighted the kind of world that we're living in right now in terms of issues such as pandemics, conflicts and climate change. And he has also talked about how this scale at which we have seen various issues emerge in different countries require that the world proceeds with collective action and that it goes ahead in terms of collaboration and cooperation with each other. Otherwise, he has warned that this is not something that can be handled by any power alone, and there is of course a need for the community to come together and to take notice of the fact that the world is in peril and that there needs to be something done about it. This is of course important in terms of the kind of scenarios that we have seen both within Pakistan and the world, in terms of the Ukrainian crisis, in terms of the food security issues that have taken the world, the rising inflation and economic prices all over the world. And then of course within Pakistan, the issues such as climate change that we've seen elsewhere also. But this is of course something that the UN Secretary General himself remarked on his visit to Pakistan is at a scale that he has never seen before. So it's going to be of course an important session of the UN General Assembly, considering where the world stands right now. That is going to be our focus of the segment today as the first part, but we're also going to be taking a look of course at the Prime Minister's meetings on the sidelines. He has met important leaders and he's also expected to be part of the reception that has been hosted by the US President Joe Biden. There has of course been no official meeting between the two since now, and then we've also seen that there hasn't been any engagement on a bilateral one-on-one setting as part of the UN General Assembly session as well. But this will be the first time that the two sides are going to be meeting informally at this reception. So we're going to be of course taking a look at the evolving situation regarding Pakistan and US ties, and then of course how it's going to evolve after this session as well, because we know that the foreign minister will visit Washington and then meet the Secretary of State later on. As you can see on your screens right now, there are numerous leaders that the Prime Minister has met, including the Iranian president as well, and he also met with the Russian President Vladimir Putin earlier. He has also met with his counterparts in various other parts of the world, and so he's also expected to meet the French leader as well. And so we're going to be taking a look at that bilateral dynamic for Pakistan as well, along with other countries of course, and then the significance of this high-level debate at the UN General Assembly session. And of course, we're going to be taking a look also at the way that this platform will allow us to highlight the issue of the devastating floods that have impacted the country since June. And there is, of course, a lot of pressure still going on in terms of how people are suffering, the kind of outbreak of diseases and health crises that we see, food security issues, the economic suffering, and of course, provision of basic necessities to these people. The UN Secretary General, along with other diplomats earlier, have arrived in the country, and they're trying to raise awareness in terms of the kind of scale of damage that exists. We also know that in the same spirit, Hollywood actress and UN humanitarian Angelina Jolie has also arrived in Pakistan. She has visited Dadu and Johi and is of course expected to provide aid as well. And because of this visit, we are expecting that this will attract more attention from the US side and elsewhere as well in terms of the kind of damage that exists and the need that Pakistan is currently facing. So we'll talk more about that as well, and how the UN General Assembly session will be providing that groundwork, since we will be having from the 19th to the 25th of September, the entire week this week, an exhibition called A Climate Carnage at the UN headquarters in New York, where the particular devastation that Pakistan is currently experiencing will be on display for the world to understand what the impact of climate change has had in Pakistan and can have elsewhere. In our second segment of the show today, we're going to be taking a look at what has happened in Canada with regards to the Khalistan movement that of course is very important to the Sikh community both within and outside of India. Apparently over 110,000 Canadian Sikhs have voted in this Khalistan referendum. There were long queues and long lines, traffic were blocked. There were a large number of people who were still unable to cast their vote when the voting ended at 5 p.m. and they had been in line since 7 in the morning. This is of course with regards to the particular desire of the people to be able to have an independent state of Khalistan with Shimla as its capital. And this is, of course, in line with Canada's own norms and principles and the UN-backed international norms as well with regards to freedom in terms of self-determination and for the people to have their right to independence. So we're going to be taking a look at how this will impact the current scenario of the Sikh community within India and outside India-Canada relations, and then, of course, the future of this Khalistan movement. For this and more, as always, in the studios, I have been joined by senior analyst Farooq Patafi, and for our first segment with regards to the UN General Assembly session, I have been joined online by Tom O'Connor, senior foreign policy writer in Newsweek and a regular at our show. Welcome, Tom. We've also been joined by Mr. Anwar Iqbal, who's joined us on telephone line. He's a senior journalist and he's traveling and has taken the time out to be a part of the debate. Thank you, Mr. Anwar, for being with us today. Let me start with you, Tom. Of course, this UN General Assembly session is extremely important for Pakistan in terms of the devastating floods that we currently are witnessing, and there are numerous people who are suffering as we speak. This is, of course, an important part of what is going to be highlighted. There are, of course, numerous other issues that we're going to be looking at as the program unfolds. But I want to talk about whether or not you see the kind of impact that this debate or this highlighting in terms of what we're trying to do and raise awareness in this week at the UN headquarters will achieve, because we have seen that we have had pledges with regards to the appeal that has been put out. We haven't had as many collections, and there's still an increasing number that we keep on seeing as we have more assessment and more data coming in from the ground, that this in fact is a very massive scale of catastrophe and we need as much help as we can. Will we be able to attract world attention regarding that?
The scale of the tragedy has really been shown.
There seems to be some problem with the voice.
Tom, can you please unmute yourself? We're going to try and connect once again with you, Tom, and hopefully there won't be any issue. Mr. Anwar, can you hear me? Mr. Anwar, are you with us? Looks like he's not. We're going to get back to both of them and hopefully we'll be able to connect. But Farooq, let me take that to you. And then when we look at, of course, the kind of damage that currently exists and kind of climate catastrophe that exists within Pakistan, this is, of course, one of the most important agendas at the moment in the UN General Assembly session as well. And we want to be able to use this platform to highlight that. We've talked about earlier the kind of need that exists in terms of sustained support, in terms of infrastructure and climate resilience that we want to be able to create within Pakistan. That is a long-term approach to help. Will we be able to get enough attention regarding that?
Right, Sana, and that is a very good question, especially because the Prime Minister of Pakistan actually tweeted that he is going to the UNGA to actually highlight Pakistan's suffering and tell Pakistan's story regarding climate, of course, regarding the recent floods as well. But this is a very important forum. Remember that it comprises the entire world, or at least entire recognized world. But that is not all. You were talking about climate change. Of course, the bigger event regarding that is going to take place in November in Egypt, you know, the climate change conference. But at this moment at UNGA, you have a lot of space to tell your story and inform everybody of what Pakistan is going through. But on the sidelines also, Prime Minister is going to have very important meetings. We have already reported on the meeting with President Macron of France, and then of course with the Italian president as well. But let me read the list to you. He is going to meet with the Australian Chancellor. He is going to meet with Austrian Chancellor, President of Spain, EU President. Then he is going to take part in Global Food Security Summit convened by the President of African Union. Then he is going to meet PM Luxembourg and IMF MD, Turkish President Biden on this interaction that you were talking about, Finnish President, Chinese PM, Japanese PM, Malaysian President Malala, and then he's going to interact with the media as well. So he gets a lot of opportunity bilaterally and multilaterally to inform the world about what Pakistan is going through and how they can help.
Absolutely, and that seems like a great opportunity for us to be able to highlight our issues with regards to climate change and, of course, the economic crisis and others, and our need for bilateral engagement, considering, of course, our relations with various countries and our approach to an independent foreign policy. Tom, can you hear me this time around? Unfortunately, we still can't hear you. Can you please unmute yourself?
I'm not on mute.
Okay, I can hear you now. Great.
Okay.
Right. So, Tom, starting off with climate change issues and the need for us to be able to talk about that. In general, of course, when we talk, there are various platforms that exist. But at the moment, this is important because this is the first big gathering right after the floods that we have seen. And we want to be able to highlight this issue as much as we can. And there is, of course, the debate with regards to sustained support in terms of climate resilient infrastructure. And then also with regards to considering loss and damage in the climate change conversation at a global level itself. Will we be able to have any progress in these two issues?
Well, it's difficult to say how much progress can be made from one international gathering, but of course, climate change is a common issue that many major powers have risen up as something that's a top concern. The problem is there action that they will actually take in order to enact these changes? Because the sad reality of climate change is that some of the biggest polluters are the ones who are least affected. It's developing nations that are experiencing some of the worst effects of this. Of course, Pakistan is a tragic example of that right now. Not that long ago, just as the floods had really taken hold about a month ago or so, I spoke with Ambassador Munir Akram at the United Nations, and he gave me a sort of action plan that could be put into place in order to avoid further crises. Because, as he said, today it's Pakistan, tomorrow it could be another country, and it probably will be another country, sad to say, given the lack of substantive action that we've seen on the part of the international community as a whole. So I think that certainly, given the scale of the tragedy in Pakistan, the floods will be something that will be a top-line agenda for Prime Minister Sharif, and I think it's something that other countries will have to listen to, whether they like it or not, given the idea that this is a common issue for all of humanity. And there hasn't been a great track record. There's been a lot of commitments made, but not enough action put onto those commitments.
Right. Tom, I just wanted to know that apart from the fact that you have interacted with our ambassador, you must be following news in your own country as well. Do you see the kind of awareness that is needed, perhaps Pakistan wants, regarding what is going on in the country?
I see an awareness of when it comes to the flood, specifically if we're talking about climate change issues. But again, I don't necessarily see the kind of action taking place. Now, it should be noted that to the Biden administration's credit, the climate change and the climate crisis has been a priority that they've set to put out. But the problem here in the U.S. is that, of course, the two different parties have very opposing opinions when it comes to the climate crisis. So it's difficult to say how far one agenda can go when there's always the risk of political change sort of undercutting it. And that's something that I think that many, not only politicians are aware of, but many businesses and many climate activists as well. So, of course, there is an outpouring of support for Pakistan right now, but will that result in substantive change for Pakistan and other developing countries that not only need support in putting forth green agendas, but also a compensation for that, because these countries are the ones that not only are affected most by climate change, but will have the most difficult time actually putting forth.
Right, absolutely, Tom. But there is, of course, a broader climate challenge that we are all facing, and then there's a matter of 33 million Pakistanis being displaced, and they having lost their livelihood and their houses. So that is a big issue, right? So do you think that the Western media particularly is covering this situation as it is?
I'm not sure that the Western media is covering perhaps the scale of the tragedy as it's seen on the ground in Pakistan. Unfortunately, the Western media, just like international media around the world, tends to have short attention spans, I think, on humanitarian crises, even political crises, honestly, when it comes to events that are happening around the world. I think that we see a lot of coverage in the short term But as far as the attention span and the longevity of this coverage, I think there's always a risk that it could be undercut by other major issues popping up. So I think that certainly there could be a disparity between the amount of attention being paid to it and the actual developments on the
Right.
ground.
Tom, when we look at, of course, the UN Secretary General's opening remarks as well, he talks about where the world is right now, and he highlights issues such as climate change, political conflicts, pandemics, and of course, the kind of issues that exist that require global collective action. And that, of course, is an important statement to make. But I want to understand the significance of this statement in light of the value that the UN General Assembly's debate in itself holds. Because, as you said, you're focusing again and again on action. And it seems that when we take a look at these discussions and the highlighting of issues at various levels, the talk or the awareness is of course important and has its own role to play. But when it comes to the significance in terms of this platform in tangible action, is that there? What are the words of the UN Secretary General worth at this moment?
Well, I think that I mean, sad to say, I think we always have to keep in mind that these are all non-binding actions. You know, the UN itself is except for the Security Council, it does tend to have a very non-binding nature to it. So it's very easy to make these sort of commitments. And of course, you know, the UN Secretary General is a very well-respected diplomat, has a very well-respected position among the international community. But again, when it comes to specific crises and addressing them, we've not seen, and I'm saying it again, the action and the track record that's needed. So I think that we'll see a lot more commitment, but it's difficult for me to really outline or forecast what kind of specific actions will be taken place by major countries. I hope that it is the case. I hope there are actions that are taken. But besides the actual crisis in Pakistan, there doesn't seem to be fundamental a change or movement on the part of other major countries toward addressing and preventing a sort of crisis like this from happening somewhere else. So I think that we'll have to look at the climate accords. We'll have to look at various national and bilateral, multilateral initiatives that are taking place. Will there be more language? We'll see.
Absolutely, that's of course important. Tom, there is also of course something that's important to Pakistan is its relations with different countries, and as Farooq was earlier mentioning, we are of course meeting with various countries and leaderships across the world, which is important to us on the sidelines of this session. One of the most important of them is of course our relationship with the US. That was unfortunately also a part of much controversy at home in terms of our internal political situation as well. And we haven't seen any interaction from the Biden administration with the previous leadership in Pakistan as well and the current as well until now. And we're expecting that first interaction to come in informally at a reception hosted by the US president. What do you think the significance or importance of this particular meeting will hold? Will it be of any value in terms of any interaction? It will be the first, but it's just an informal meeting, not a one-on-one session.
Will it have any consequences?
Sure. Well, I spoke with Prime Minister Sharif. I interviewed him last month, and I'm very well aware of his administration's focus on wanting to rekindle ties with the West and the United States specifically. This is a priority of this administration. We know this. It has, as you mentioned, been a difficult road, and that's for a lot of reasons that are particular to the bilateral relationship of the U.S. and Pakistan, as well as the very difficult geopolitical situation concerning major powers right now. I think that there is an opportunity right here to improve those U.S.-Pakistan relations with the new administration in. I think that there are serious initiatives from the Pakistani side being proposed when it comes to not only political but economic and people-to-people relationships that can be fostered by these two administrations, by Prime Minister Sharif's and President Biden's. So I think that any opportunity to come face to face and to have these meetings, even if we start on an informal level, is certainly still an opportunity to improve those relations and bring them to a place where both countries would like to see them. So I think there is hope for that. I think there are differences and I think there are still difficulties, but the only way they'll be solved is by these sort of interactions.
Right. With your permission, Sana, I want to actually go back to the UNGA summit. Tom, let me ask you about something very interesting that you earlier pointed out. Regarding the attention span of international media and perhaps policy docket as well. Let me ask you, at this moment there seem to be many overriding influences or events that are actually impacting the global consciousness. One, of course, is climate change, the other one is Ukraine, And we know that either President Putin has addressed his nation or he is going to shortly, and it seems ominous. So do you think that there is a chance that this UNGA might become something about Russia rather than climate change?
Right, and Tom, before you answer that, let me just welcome in the debate Mr. Anwar Iqbal, who's a senior journalist and joined us on telephone line. Mr. Anwar, can you hear me? Welcome to the debate.
Yes, I can. I don't know why we keep getting disconnected.
You're connected now. You're live.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Tom, you can continue with your answer.
Sure. I think that the Russia-Ukraine conflict will certainly dominate a lot of the discussions, not only perhaps at the UNGA itself as a body, but among member states in these meetings. This is certainly one of the greatest tests of the international order that countries are facing, and it affects everyone, including Pakistan, to some degree. Now, I think it's very interesting that this comes off the heels, this gathering of the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, of course, which Pakistan and the Prime Minister took part in. We did not see a lot of conversation as a body toward Ukraine there, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One being that it's a largely Asian security body and is trying to address regional affairs. But of course, Russia and China and various member states did address it in their own conversations. Now, when it comes to the UN has made a clear position that the war must come to an end. Obviously, there are great differences among member states, but Russia is finding itself in a very difficult position trying to defend the conflict and trying to prevent things from, I think, further escalating to a point where it's completely isolated among the international community. Of course, certain countries have taken a more balanced approach towards the conflict. That includes Pakistan, which has, of course, expressed concerns toward the conflict, but has not come out and outright tried to portray it as a one-sided thing. I think that we'll see a lot of member states try to find out if there's any opportunity towards advancing an end to the conflict in their own private conversations. And that certainly does run the risk of dominating over the climate change discussion, because these geopolitical uncertainties surrounding that always seem more immediate and dangerous than something that's more intangible. Even though, admittedly, we do see the tangible effects of climate change, and perhaps that's even a greater or equal existential issue. But I think that, yes, there will be a lot of conversation over the Russia-Ukraine conflict. As to whether there will be any advancement to that solution, I think that's really still up to the two belligerents in the conflict, Russia and Ukraine, toward that end, and perhaps NATO as well.
Right. Mr. Anwar, when we look at, of course, the UN General Assembly session, there are, of course, numerous factors that are important, as we were earlier discussing with Tom. But there is, of course, the issue of climate change, which is very current and relevant to Pakistan at the moment. We have this entire week also there, which is talking about this particular climate carnage, and we don't want that to be overshadowed. But then when we talk about issues such as climate change, as was being discussed, they do unfortunately somehow are taken over by other factors. There are, of course, important issues that the UN Secretary General highlighted in terms of pandemics and conflicts and global destruction that is going on at the moment. But what do you think will emerge as the most important agendas of the UN General Assembly session? And for Pakistan, do you think that it's going to contribute to the climate change catastrophe we're currently experiencing?
And Anwar Sahab, just because I know you as a friend, I want to brag about it as well. Could you also tell us how many UNGA summits you have actually covered so far?
22.
Anwar Sahab, can you hear us?
Hello. Yes, I can. I have attended about 20. This will be my 23rd, I think.
Yeah, but you have been covering these speeches of the Prime Minister and presidents for decades, right?
Yes. The first I attended was when Unity was the Prime Minister.
Yeah. Can I ask a question, Sana?
Sure. Mr. Anwar, if you could also respond to mine.
Yeah. Could you repeat it?
Which is what should Pakistan expect from the UNGA, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's what basically you asked, right? I think there is reason for us to be hopeful. The world is focused on climate change. The UN chief visited Pakistan. U.S. delegation, an interagency delegation went there. And then, of course, the media, NGOs, various U.S. agencies have been highlighting the impact of climate change in Pakistan, how this flood had affected the country. They described this as an unprecedented flood of biblical proportions, with, how millions of people became homeless, how so many died and everything. So I think, and then of course, all the agencies and officials have been warning against further consequences like diseases, food shortage, and all those things. So the world is focused on it and apparently willing to do something, but how much will be done is yet to be determined, because you see there are other issues that sort of preoccupy debates on international platforms, like the Ukrainian issue, and then economic crisis that various countries are facing, humanitarian crisis that various countries are facing, and that's why we are not seeing as big a response to these floods as we saw in 2001 or during the earthquake, but still the world is aware. But more than what actually financial or economic assistance these floods bring to Pakistan, what will be more important is the focus on climate change and the realization of the need to do something for the countries that make very little contribution to global warming, but they suffer its consequences. So I think ultimately, if not during this General Assembly, but this debate that has been generated by the floods in Pakistan, that will ultimately lead to a positive conclusion.
Absolutely. Can you also tell us what to expect from Prime Minister's speech, sir? Particularly what areas might be focused? I understand that Kashmir and floods are going to be a certainty. Can you identify other issues that might also be part of his speech?
As I said, climate change, yes. And he said so. He has already indicated that that's what he's going to talk about, and he's trying to draw the world's attention to this issue. Kashmir is always raised by Pakistan whenever Pakistani leaders address the UN. And but this year, the debate on Kashmir will not generate as much interest as it usually does, because the Indian Prime Minister is not attending. So Pakistan will speak. Pakistan will raise the Kashmir issue. It will highlight the human rights violations committed by Indian forces in Kashmir, and some lower-level Indian diplomat will respond to it. So it probably will not make sort of headline news in the international media, but Pakistan will talk about it. And Pakistan also will talk about Afghanistan. But I think this year, in the Prime Minister's speech, will be focusing on climate change.
Right. Mr. Anwar, of course, another issue that was highlighted by the Foreign Minister, Bilawal Bhutto, was, of course, with regards to Islamophobia. And this is something that last year in the UN General Assembly session, there was much progress for Pakistan in terms of an international day being recognized by the UN as March 15th as the day against Islamophobia. And this is, of course, important considering the issues that we see not only in our region, but, of course, in the West as well. There is, of course, this resolution that was a good step forward for the Muslim communities around the world. But do you think that this will be taking another step forward in any way in terms of any plan of action, or in any way mobilization of the collective action that the Secretary General keeps referring to? Will we have any progress with regards to Islamophobia?
Well, I think the Foreign Minister already indicated that in his speech at the OIC committee yesterday, when he said that they want the UN Secretary General to appoint a special envoy who should be exclusively focusing on Islamophobia. And I think this is achievable. This can be done, and having a special envoy for this particular issue will actually translate to highlighting the issue whenever it is needed. And but let me add something very positive about this foreign minister's attitude. You see, the last year it was earlier this year when he came here for another UN meeting, and he talked about some issues that were tackled by the previous government, and he said that no, I'm not going to criticize that, because those issues was tackled by a Prime Minister of Pakistan, and we own them. And this year again, he didn't acknowledge that this resolution on Islamophobia was adopted during the previous regime, and he wanted to. So I think this is a positive attitude, a positive development for Pakistani politics, where we try to undo or disown everything done by the previous government. But this foreign minister is a little different from others on this issue.
Right. When we take a look, of course, at this issue, Tom, there is, of course, that need of collective action of the Muslim community and the OIC to get together and understand that's important because it's most relevant to these communities in these countries. And that, of course, is a requirement. But there is, of course, a lot of issues of Islamophobia in the West and the non-Muslim countries around the world as well. And perhaps we can also talk about it in general terms and not boil it down to one particular religion in terms of intolerance or other incidents that, of course, happen anywhere as part of any community or religion. Shouldn't that be a reason of more involvement from the West or non-Muslim countries with regards to this campaign?
I think this issue should not be confined to the West.
Right,
or
Mr. Anwar,
any
let me just take
region.
Tom's opinion on this. But Tom, unfortunately, I can't hear you again. Can you please unmute yourself?
Can you hear me
All right.
now?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can. Go ahead.
I'll say this, time and time again, we've seen in the current and the past, of course, instances where powers wanted to align themselves with hardliners and find scapegoats in various countries, whether they were religious or ethnic minorities, and only to produce greater instability, greater hatred, greater unrest in the long term. And it's tempting. We've seen it in the U.S., we've seen it in South Asia, we've seen it in Eastern Europe, Middle East, places across the globe. So the target is not specific. It's the temptation of wanting to mobilize the masses along a certain line of usually it's nationalism of some sort, of some brand. And it's tempting because there's short-term gains to that, but the long-term losses and risks are certainly very significant, and we're seeing that play out in cities and countries across the world. So it's an issue that really needs to be addressed, and I think that there are certain initiatives out there looking towards de-escalation, but as long as populist leaders, I think, still try to align themselves with these lines of thought in an effort to gain support, I think it's going to remain a very serious issue that crosses not only ethnic or religious, but national and continental lines. And we see these groups sometimes get together, various, whether it's white nationalism, whether it's fundamental Islam, whether it's Hindu nationalism, various strains of thoughts from different lines of countries and ideologies. I mean, it's something that really has to be addressed, I think, in a very significant, comprehensive, and open-minded manner. Because again, if we focus too much on Islamophobia, if we focus too much on anti-Semitism specifically, I think that we lose the idea that these ideologies are very much linked together, much more than they're actually, I think, opposed to one another. So it is something that I think needs international action across different camps.
I'm really glad that while mentioning Islamophobia, you also mentioned anti-Semitism. There seems to be the same source of this hate. Is there a possibility that advocates against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism can actually get together and then collectively advocate against it?
Well, I mean, it seems like one of those in a perfect world situations, but I think if we want to address the core of this threat, that's going to have to be inevitability, or it's going to have to be the only solution to really get this in various countries. Again, each country has its own specific circumstances and conditions, so there's not a one-fits-all solution. But I think very much teaching tolerance, again, across religious lines, I think that's really the key here to addressing these very deep-rooted issues. And we have to look at how these issues are produced, whether it comes to education, economic conditions, people not having access to the full picture. Of course, political parties, again, especially those who align themselves with certain populist ideals, certainly like to stoke this sort of misinformation when it comes to religion, when it comes to, again, ethnicity, immigration, certain things that fuel these and perpetuate these ideas, these falsehoods about certain communities. And I think that if we are able to address that and have an honest conversation across religious lines, then perhaps and hopefully we'll make progress. And that, I think, should be replicated, of course, on the international level among nations, even ones that don't see it eye to eye.
Absolutely. Anwar Iqbal Sahab, earlier you were talking about Islamophobia. It is an important factor, but we have created this International Day regarding Islamophobia. Do you think that apart from that there has been further progress on that front as well, sir. Anwar Iqbal sir.
I think we've unfortunately lost Mr. Anwar.
Yeah. Today, our communication seems to be like a military academy. Bits of it keep passing out.
Right, but we made it through this far and we'll be able to do it in the next few minutes as well. But of course, when we talk about the gain that Pakistan is going to have, and I wanted to take Anwar Iqbal Saab's take on it as well, but Farooq, I'll take yours.
Yeah.
When we take a look at whatever is going to be gained out of it, of course, you highlighted the various meetings that the Prime Minister is going to have or has had on the sidelines of this session. There is, of course, the important meeting with the US, as I was discussing with Tom earlier as well. But in terms of the kind of positive outlook that we want in terms of this particular platform or the session, what will be the key achievements or accomplishments, so to speak, in terms of Pakistan looking back and taking home? And also when we take a look particularly at the dynamic with the US in light of the meeting with the Russian president earlier as well, and the way that the relationships have been marred by controversy, how do you think will this informal meeting be able to pave a way for the two leaders to meet at some point?
Sure, why not? Look, Sana, here's the thing. You know, I'll bring you back to Pakistan and what is going on here, right? Pakistan seems to be on the cusp of a change. We have a choice at this moment, whether we are going to be ideationally confused nation, somebody who is actually too much actually absorbed in obscurantism or confusion, or for that matter, it is a practical country which exercises diplomacy as should be, right? At this moment, Pakistan being a nation state needs to have as many allies as possible. So Russia, talking to Russia is important. Of course, that doesn't mean Pakistan endorses Russia's action in Ukraine or its war in Ukraine. But Pakistan would certainly want to have a very good relationship, better relationship with the US, because it has been part of our system. It has been part of how we think, right? At this moment, we are speaking in English. We don't. Can you speak in Russian or Chinese, or for that matter, any other language? Most of us can't. So it is very important that Pakistan connects with the US, but at this moment there are many moving parts. You have to look at what is going on inside America as well. You were talking about climate change. Remember that there is a party, Republican Party, a big part of it actually deny any kind of climate change. In fact, when President Trump was in power, he actually disengaged his country from Paris Accord. So at this moment, all these matters are important, and Pakistan needs to connect with the US and the US vice versa. I'm hoping that this sideline interaction is going to lead to a broader engagement between the two countries.
Right, of course, that is the hope. Tom, when we take a look at the UN General Assembly session, of course, we've talked about how this particular platform is going to be significant in terms of any tangible action, and we've talked about how the UN in itself is not binding. But then when we take a look at the way that different conflicts and issues around the world have unfolded, what do you think will be the future in terms of the international collaboration, not through these platforms, but in general? Of course, the sidelines and the meetings are important, but in the way that the different countries are interacting with each other, in the way that the dynamics of different relationships are unfolding, will we be able to move closer for collective action for issues that affect all of us, like climate change? You'll have to go through the process of unmuting yourself once again, I think, because we can't hear you.
And I hope we are not muted at your end.
No.
I can hear you now. Yes.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think that one thing I'll say on this for certain is that the world cannot afford any sort of division into certain blocks that are unable to communicate with each other. This was actually a core message of my interview with Prime Minister Sharif last month, and I think it's something that is important not only when it comes to geopolitical issues, but also when it comes to climate change and to other humanitarian crises the world is facing. For example, when the floods first ravaged Pakistan, I think that it was telling to see an outpouring of support from various countries in the region. Pakistan has a lot of good relationship with its immediate neighbors, but even India, there was talk of providing some sort of support. Of course, there's a lot of controversy attached to that, but I think it's important that in times like that, there does seem to be a prevailing a need or a desire to want to help because it's a common problem. We have to take that same approach, I think, to many international crises. Even again, if countries do not see eye to eye, they should remain in contact. I think that any sort of diplomacy is not a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of strength when it comes to wanting to or showing the willingness to want to solve problems, even if they seem intractable or impossible. So I think that if we talk about collective action, there needs to remain a ongoing dialogue among nations, even ones that are diametrically opposed to one another in areas, in order to facilitate any sort of substantial action or change needed to address the crises as large as climate change,
right, absolutely.
large nuclear conflicts.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Tom, but unfortunately that's all that we have time for. But thank you so much. And of course, there is a need for that. But well, we're going to, of course, be seeing whether or not that actually happens. But thank you for being a part of the debate and being with us. Yes, Farooq, very quickly.
Very quickly, regarding the Prime Minister's visit, I understand that Pakistan's politics is very polarized, and because of that, there is a party which seems to be disaffected, and its supporters keep on agitating wherever they go. Remember, when Indian Prime Minister goes anywhere, their opposition does not actually protest there, right? It is important to remember that whether you agree with the politics of the existing government or not, it is the office of the Prime Minister which should command respect, and I think the entirety of Pakistani community should be standing with Pakistan's ambassador, that is Prime Minister of Pakistan,
right,
when he goes and conveys Pakistan's story and message.
Right, absolutely. We only have 2 minutes for our next segment. So, Farooq, very quickly with regards to the Khalistan movement and the referendum in Canada, there are, of course, a large number of people that have voted. And this has happened previously as well, and is important, of course, to the Khalistan movement. But in terms of the value that this referendum holds and in terms of the impact that it's going to have or has had in the past on the movement, what do you think will be the way that this is going to be taken up, both within India and outside of India, and whether or not these referendums actually have contributed to any progress of this movement?
Right, Sanad, it is important when you look at the way Sikh community is divided at this moment. Those who are outside India actually clearly want Khalistan to be made, right? And they're very clear because there's no pressure on them from any external, factor that they have to conform to some idea. But when you talk about people who are inside India, they are under so much pressure since Khalistan movement that they have to denounce it and they cannot support it usually. There are here and there outliers, but most of the people cannot come out because they are immediately, thanks to what Congress did for decades and what BJP has done in this decade, they are immediately declared anti-national,
right,
that they want that so-called tukde gang, that they want the country to fall into pieces. But when you talk about the sentiment of Sikh community all over the world, I assure you, I've interacted with too many people, and most of them tell you that after the hell our Sikh brethren have gone through, they deserve their own homeland. I don't know whether it is going to contribute to the movement or momentum inside India, but international community in which, because there are so many people who are well placed, as Canada's ministers are Sikh, there are other people who are pro-Khalistan and at an important place. They certainly will keep on bringing up the pressure.
Absolutely. And very quickly, the kind of impact this has on India-Canada relations.
I think that when the last time Canadian Prime Minister visited India, the way he was snubbed is clear indication what India is thinking. India's behavior has been such since the current international trade minister was at that time made defense minister in the cabinet of Prime Minister Trudeau. At that time, while PM went inside India and kept on touring, he was thoroughly snubbed, and the media actually kept on attacking him as well. I think Canada is going to stay put, but Indian attitude and its arrogance will continue the way it has.
Right. Thank you very much, Farooq Tafi, for being with us as always in the show.
Thank you.
That's all that we have from the debate, and we'll see you tomorrow, giving you more updates with regards to the UN General Assembly session and more news around the world.